be able to do a little bit. Yep. We're going to be able to do a little bit more with that outreach. It's going to allow us to update our system, our data system, and our outreach system, so that it will make it a little bit easier to use a software system for you to sign on to, or just download a letter and send it right away. So please be on the lookout for that in the next, in the upcoming months. And when you get those alerts, please take action on them. It's so important that we are raising our voices down here on the South Coast to get that, to get that point across. So please.
Thank you. Great.
Yep.
All right, you can, if you'd move forward.
Sure thing.
Thank you.
Did I? I didn't. Yeah.
No, it didn't go forward.
There we go.
Yes, perfect. Okay, we also have the capacity building working group, and we have developed our priorities based on the food system assessment from 2021, which was really to build a vibrant regional food system. Within that, we were looking at some very particular priorities of building a regional food innovation district and increasing the refrigerated and storage spaces, and identifying partners and solutions in food waste and expanding the network capacity. Liz, would you like to say anything about the hard work that's been done?
Sure. We let me let this person in. Hold on.
Yeah.
We've done a couple of deep dives with looking at food innovation centers. They can be different to everybody. So when you say that term, all of you are probably conjuring up a different image in your head, and they're all right. But in the terms that we're looking at it, and Rita, who wasn't able to introduce herself but is there, I see you there now. She and I have been working closely together on this for the region, and trying to identify, can we, does it make sense to have a food innovation center down here? Yes. Where does it make sense? Not sure. If you build it, will they come? We've done a couple of deep dives with this. We're looking at, it's not just about food aggregation, which Coastal Food Shed does and does extremely well, but that is a component of it. It's also about processing and distribution, and bringing in, product from farms that then needs to get cut and cleaned and ready for food, buyers such as Rob, who's on this call, or other institutions or restaurants that don't have the capacity within their own infrastructure to do that type of cleaning and chopping and getting food prepped and ready to then cook with. And so just trying to figure out all of those aspects, and trying to figure out how, like, where are our assets and where are the things that we need and what are the gaps. It's a big question. Logistically, it's a big question. Digitally, it's a big issue. Rita, you want to comment about sort of the feedback that we've gotten from the islands as far as their needs, and yet they're jumping over Southeastern Mass? I think that's a big component of this.
Yes, so especially as both of the islands are starting to look at resiliency, and looking at resiliency in food systems and coastal resiliency, Martha's Vineyard, especially, and Island Grown Initiative, have 50% by 2050 as one of their goals. And that's could half of what the island is eating be sourced locally, which I think they're using the USDA terms, which is within 400 miles. But they've been in touch, and they're wanting to know how can they get more food from that kind of first really 100 miles. And again, it's easier to buy from about 400 miles and regionally from Vermont and New York State. And we still are missing this infrastructure. And the South Coast should be sort of the first port of call for both of the islands, but without some of the key infrastructure around the distribution and the aggregation points and the processing, especially for some of the local smaller fishermen, we end up getting skipped over. So when we're looking at the Food Innovation Center and what do we need and how much do we need and how big do we need, starting to have conversations with the islands and looking at what's the demand that they have, and including some of that demand into what we would be calculating for our Food Innovation Center or something similar.
Yeah. So continuing to have those types of conversations, continuing to figure out what our region really needs and look at more asset mapping. And I think, you know, this digital infrastructure piece, like where those gaps are, is kind of, and the cottage laws, you know, what are some of the other things that are hindering people from building a vibrant regional food system right here in Southeastern Mass right now, is sort of the focus of this working group.
That's great. Perfect summary. With that, we'll move on to the Food Access Working Group. Perfect. Okay. All right. So our main goal coming out of the food system assessment with our priorities is to increase the available, healthy, culturally relevant local food. And our main priority is basically to establish a farm to food relief program and to establish a gleaning program. So we are working very hard and we have done huge work on this. And Liz, do you want to break the ground on this?
Yeah, so I think most of you have heard this through different avenues, but it's still exciting news and I like saying it every time. So here we go. So we've been working on, you know, knowing that this is one of the top priorities for our food access working group, was how are we going to increase the amount of local, healthy, culturally relevant foods into the food system. And obviously we have great entities that are doing some of this work. Sharing the Harvest, which is part of the South Coast YMCA, has their farm to food relief program, and United Way is doing a lot of this, and PACE does a lot of this, working with local farmers. And so this is happening, and how can we build upon it and how can we expand it is really what Frogfoot Farm is all about. So in partnership with AD Makepeace, cranberry growers down here in Wareham, they have leased 6 acres of land to us. This is not farmland. This is land that's never been farmed. It's so 6 acres that are surrounded by cranberry bogs that are being decommissioned. And the Marion Institute is leasing this land. We're on the hook for fundraising and grant writing and bringing in the money to get this first turned over just to farmland, because it's just sandy marginal soil right now. And then starting to get this farm up and running so that we can start, everything that will be grown on it will go to food relief. But then the second part of it is that establishing a gleaning program. So Southeastern Mass is home to over 1,500 farms, and we have no formalized gleaning program in our region. Boston has the Boston area gleaners, and in Rhode Island, they have Hope's Harvest, which both do amazing jobs of recovering a lot of food that would otherwise go to waste in the fields. Farmers often have, excess crops due to just, planning that way for disaster. And then, if they have crops that they either don't have the labor to harvest those crops or they don't have a market to sell it to, that food can go to waste in the fields. But with a gleaning program, we can send volunteers that have been trained to these farms to harvest those crops, and then all of that would go into the food relief system. From another lens, Christine was talking earlier about what we're working on with advocacy and policy. That's why it's so important for us to advocate for that ability for farmers to get tax incentives when they do donate food like this. So it's all sort of interconnected as you start to see the thread that runs all through this. So this farm will be up and running next year. We won't be harvesting, obviously, running all 6 acres. We're hoping to farm 1 or 2 acres next year. It will be a gradual process as we bring in more and more capacity for it. And then this past last week, we had our first fundraiser, and some of you were there, called Boogie at the Bog. It was really great turnout of people, new people.
I have a slide for that if you want to use that.
Well, I want to come back to, I want to go back to the Bio-Blitz for while this is up to, while it's fresh in my head. But anyway, start to get involved. We're going to need volunteers. We're going to need help on every level. So learn more, stay involved, reach out to me if you want more information about Frogfoot Farm. Rita,
fantastic.
I'm going to over to you just to make sure that we touch upon the Bio-Blitz and what was done and let people know.
Yeah, so there's a couple different pieces to the planning out of the farm. One is getting food into food relief, emergency food relief programs. Another is growing crops that are culturally relevant. This is something that isn't entirely missing from what's being grown, but specifically we want to really look at, for people who are in the emergency food relief system, what are crops that are missing that they would like to see more of. Volunteerism is a big piece of it, and a Bio-Blitz was an opportunity to start to grow our volunteer base. But also another piece of the Frogfoot puzzle is part of this farming, regeneratively farming with the environment in mind. And so we're using these principles of agroecology, which we'll have lots more information out about soon in the future. But one of the primary pieces of agroecology is making sure that you are supporting pollinators and supporting wildlife and supporting biodiversity. So in order to understand the impact that our farming is having on the land, we needed to get a baseline of what's there in terms of plants and animals and invertebrates. So we did what's called a Bio-Blitz, which is a citizen science event. So it's meant to get people out there, get them on the farm. It's not meant to be precise. So we know everyone's not a botanist or a bug specialist, but we had about 20 people, 15 adults and 6 kids or so, all looking for plants and bugs and writing down everything that they saw. And that will serve as our baseline. And it is something that we hope to do every year and probably a couple times a year in some capacity, because obviously what is growing and what's buzzing about and flying about will be different depending on the season.
It was super fun. So fun to see people out there enjoying the land. And that really is such a big part of this, having this ability. There's some pictures of Boogie at the bog, having the ability for us to be able to, there's Dale. How about that picture, Dale? Having the ability to just connect people to land and to one another, I think is so important. So we just invite you to get involved some way, somehow. It's just a good way to connect with each other, but also for a good cause. So there's just a few good pictures. I love that picture of you, Dale. I will send it, I promise. Does anybody have any questions about capacity building or the farm or food access before we move on? Okay.
Okay. There is more to food access. Within this group and within the Friday meetings that we've been having, we've been discussing what are the crises that are happening in our local neighborhoods. One of the things that was really clear to us was that there's a need for people to help people who live in hotels. There's a lot of people who are currently in hotels, including the migrants that are coming into our area. So out of the South Coast Food Policy Council Food Access Working Group with this idea that why don't we teach people how to cook if they're living in a hotel, cook with a crock pot. And that also came from our local Unitarian Universalists in Fairhaven. They had done a drive for crock pots, and they came and said to us, hey, we have all these crock pots, which we do. So we discussed it and came up with this initiative, which was a fantastic idea of getting people who live in hotels, teaching them how to cook with the food they would get on WIC or food they would get in a food pantry. This was a huge undertaking of a lot of different partners. So hands off, hats off to all those partners involved in there. And I understand that that might continue with some funding outside of this, but it was an initiative. And it's just to point out, this is an initiative of the South Coast Food Policy Council in just recognizing there's a crisis and taking action and coordinating. So thank you to all the partners involved in this. There's other pieces that we're working on, Liz, if you could move that forward one. Thank you. So we have been asked to reinitiate those Friday emergency meetings that we had started, that Liz had actually started during the pandemic early on. And we meet every Friday at 11 o'clock. And we just basically discuss what is really happening. Mostly there are food pantries and different food providers on the call, but anybody is welcome. We are currently actually talking through two different crises. One is with migrant families that are coming into the area, and we're trying to figure out who is doing what and how do we support those efforts? So that is a big piece of what we're currently working on. The other piece is really looking at how do we get more food into the food pantries. This also came out of this idea of this meeting and in the food access working group, where we are looking at how do we work with the Greater Boston Food Bank to bring more food into this area. So we're working in just the beginning of the logistics and figuring out that kind of coordination with those food banks, that food pantries that are work with USDA commodities, specifically from the Greater Boston Food Bank. So that's another initiative that came out of the South Coast Food Policy Council. We encourage you to jump on to these calls every Friday at 11 o'clock. We want to hear from you. We want to hear what's happening in your community and work together to coordinate responses. Want to say anything else, Bliss? Or anybody else?
Yeah, I'm just typing into the thing that I can't access the link
Okay.
right because of what I have up on my screen, but as soon as I
Okay.
stop sharing, I will I'll share the Zoom link for anybody that doesn't have access to it so that you have it in your calendar, and it's every Friday at 11 o'clock and you're all welcome to join. But I'll send that shortly.
Okay. Thank you. I spoke earlier about food equity advisors. So it's a big part of what we do. So food equity advisors are people with lived experience of hunger, and we work very tightly with them. We've been working since the very beginning of identifying people in the community to work with. Currently, we have 2 folks from Fall River and 2 from New Bedford that we work with. We meet with them as a professional. Some of them are in our working groups. Some of them we work with one-on-one, and everybody's got very different interests and different ways that they want to engage in the South Coast Food Policy Council with their particular skills and what they want to do. We do provide a stipend for folks that is dependent upon grants. So we are as a nonprofit looking for grants for our work, just putting that out there. So like I said, some of the food equity advisors, they attend working groups. Some of them attended community advisory board meetings, provide their thoughts and advocate for their particular actions. I want to give an example. One of our food equity advisors kept talking about how she would go into an emergency room in a hospital and she would say, nobody knows about SNAP, nobody knows about HIP, nobody has any food resources and so on. She kept bringing that up and we heard, and some of our community advisory board members are from different healthcare systems and they took action on that. So it is important that the voices at the table are all heard. Recently, we've been working with our food equity advisors to actually train them and work with them to provide written testimony. So that has been over the last few years, several of them have done that many times on HIP or on things that they care about, including one of them provided video testimony to the White House listening session from last year. And then the media contacted her and did an interview with her. So that was amazing. And she was totally excited, and she couldn't believe that she now has a voice in the community and she can make an impact. And we have also had our food equity advisors contact their legislators and write letters asking them to support very specific issues. So we work with them on however folks want to be involved. And currently I'm working with a person who really wanted more culturally appropriate food in the food pantry. So she worked with the community to put a list together, and then she went to the food pantry and asked them to order that and to provide those types of culturally appropriate food. And that was really more of an empowerment advocacy and just trying to push forward and work on that. And so another one is trying to get education in Spanish for nutritious, how do you cook with nutritious food for her particular community. So it's fantastic to work with the food equity advisors at all the different levels. And we're loving that. And we think it's deeply important. And they find it's deeply important to them to have their voices heard and make a lasting impact.
So Josh had a question asking if you could get access to the culturally relevant food list that they put together. We're happy to share that out. And I think it's also just important to recognize that that was done with a community that's in the north end of New Bedford. So it may or may not, depending on, what neighborhood or what region you're filling, it may or may not work for you, right? As far as what's culturally relevant, but happy to share that. I just wanted to So to throw that out there. Go ahead,
And
Jeff.
again, this research is just so helpful to groups like ours that just don't have the bandwidth to do it. So thank you for the work. That's exciting.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks, Josh.
And I think that's also helpful to hear too, because I think that it can be quite specific community level specificity when it comes to the cultural relevance, depending on who is living there. But again, sometimes just the bandwidth of being able to get that information is tough. So it's good to know that you need help with that, and then also just sharing what we have, but also knowing that it does depend on where you're located too.
Thanks again.
Yeah. So we'll move forward, and while we're doing the next section, I'll pop that document in. So I want to take this opportunity to recognize and introduce to you Emily Breen. She is our co-chair of the South Coast Food Policy Council Community Advisory Board. Emily is a Wareham resident of 5 years. She's moved to the South Coast after graduating from Northeastern University in 2019 with a BS in Human Services and a concentration in food systems and public health. And what Emily's going to do, she's a grant program officer with Health Resources and Action, a Boston-based public health institute, and she's going to share about a particular grant she has. So let's make you a co-host. So Emily, you are now a co-host.
Thanks, Christine. Can you all hear me okay? My Wi-Fi's been a little slow. Okay, great. Thanks for giving me a few minutes to share today. I don't have slides or anything, but I do have a couple of things I'll drop in the chat for you all. So as Christine said, I work with Health Resources and Action based in Boston. I work primarily on one particular program called the Massachusetts Community Health and Healthy Aging Funds. It's quite the name. We're still figuring out how to shorten that. But it's a grant program that was born out of a change in the legislation around the state's determination of need funding. So hospitals, when they do large scale projects, contribute funds to this determination of need program, and they now are funneled into a statewide initiative that sort of helps distribute the funding throughout the state. So our overall goal is to disrupt barriers to health, including structural racism, poverty, and power imbalances. And we do that by investing in community-centered approaches that really focus on policy, systems, and environmental change. So really moving kind of upstream beyond direct service to really be changing the policies and systems that impact our health. So focusing on social determinants of health, things like food security, housing, employment. And we do the grant program now every other year. So I will say we aren't currently accepting full applications, but what I wanted to share with you today also is that we are accepting ideas. So we're inviting people who might be interested in the funds to share ideas or approaches that they're taking to address social determinants of health, so that we can provide feedback, help let you know if you're eligible, if your approach is sort of aligned with the fund's purpose, and give you some tips to kind of build out the proposal for the full application process. So I will drop the page that describes that process here for you all. In the request for ideas, there's a little bit more background on the funds. I'm also happy to answer any questions that might be helpful. And then just to highlight for you all too, on the page, we have some key dates. So we're accepting ideas right now through the fall. That will end at the end of November. And then we are planning to launch fully by like December or January with all of the information I'm sure you're wondering about in terms of like the full application process. And then accepting applications through the spring and making awards in time for the July 1 start date. So I threw a lot at you. There's a lot more about the funds that I'm sure you'll find on the website, or I'm happy to answer. I'll put my email in the chat as well so that you can reach out and connect that way. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. Fantastic. We're excited for this grant. There's a lot of good grants out there, and this is just one of them. So we encourage the sharing of information around grants. So we're delighted you were here. Thank you, Emily. So now I'm going to go back to the screen share, and we'll talk about another piece of the work that Marianne's Institute does that actually connects with the South Coast Food Policy Council.
You want to go back to just the picture of the kidder thing?
Yeah, I just want to, is that okay?
Sure.
Okay.
on a second. Am I showing it right now?
No.
Yeah, give me a second.
Right.
I can just speak to it honestly. Let's
Yeah.
just.
Okay.
So many of you I've probably reached out to. I'm looking at you, the people that I've sent emails about this. So we were so excited to have Tracy Kidder. Some of you might recognize that name from his book Mountains Beyond Mountains. He's a Pulitzer Prize winning author. He's amazing. And he just wrote a new book called Rough Sleepers. And so Rough Sleepers is the work that he has done with Dr. Jim O'Connell, who's the president of Mass General Hospital's Healthcare for the Homeless program, where they started this many years ago. And basically, started the street teams and the work of going out into the street and actually providing healthcare during the night to Boston's homeless, and what's grown from there, and what they've been able to do together is as a program has been absolutely amazing. So Tracy Kidder followed Dr. Jim O'Connell for 5 years and his team and wrote this book called Rough Sleepers. And we were supposed to have them on November 1st. We were really looking forward to just breaking down those silos again and again of, food insecurity, homelessness, housing, transportation, healthcare. These are all just interconnected. And so we were just using them as a platform to sort of start that conversation and get different groups there from everywhere on the South Coast. They just reached out to me this past week, and apparently they're both getting totally sick all the time because they've been traveling so much with the book tour that they need to give their bodies a little bit of a break. They're still excited to come down. We're still excited to host them. We're just postponing the event to winter, early spring, maybe. I haven't got a new date yet. But if I've sent you an email, I will be following up with a follow-up email to let you know also, so that if you forwarded it to your networks, you'll have a new thing that just says postponed, new date to be determined. So if you've registered, it's still going to happen. But that's where that stands right now. I just wanted to make sure we're trying to get the word out everywhere we can about what's happening with that. So I think that's it.
Okay. All right.
It's really about questions for you guys. What questions do you have for us?
You can just take yourself off of mute and share.
Christine has put the link of the culturally relevant foods in the chat. If anybody's making sure you check in the chat for all the things. I put the Zoom link for our Friday meetings. You just back in.
Okay.
Any other follow-up questions, thoughts? I'm looking at you, Tori. Come on, Tori, you want to say anything? Needs out there?
I mean, the needs are the same. We just need more food.
We need more food. That's why some of you emailed, chatted privately. Yes, the Friday meeting is really open to anybody. I will say the last month or so, our focus is really on addressing not only getting the word out about the need. Some of the work that we've been doing on that is we've started talking with New Bedford Light and some other avenues of trying to do a series on food insecurity for our region. And so we've asked members of our CAB that are members of the South Coast Food Policy Council, some of you that are partners through SFPC members at large. I'm looking at you, Josh, right now. Being able to get the voices out, it shouldn't just all come from us, right? So we want to make sure that if we do this series, we're also elevating all of your voices. So if you're interested in being interviewed for, a segment, or you're interested in writing an article that could be uploaded, let me know. Send an email to Christine and I, and we will put you in the queue for setting up this series that we're doing with the New Bedford Light, which I think is a good way to start getting the word out. It's not the only way. We know that it's also important for folks to hear it from different avenues. Marsha, I'm looking at you as far as how to get the word out about some of this stuff in Fall River, and making sure that your channels are picking this up as well. So just want to want to make sure we're just trying to elevate, right? Like that's one of the outcomes of what's happening on those Friday calls is that we're in crisis. There's not enough food. There's not enough food coming from the Greater Boston Food Bank. Often they're on these calls on Fridays. They've had so many labor shortages and so many issues on their end that's bogged down supply chains and getting more food down to the South Coast. So how do we let our communities know that this is an issue? So that's one thing. And then obviously the other big issue that's being discussed every Friday is how to coordinate and help and support food response for the migrant families that are being put up in Wareham and Fairhaven and Swansea and Somerset and Fall River and Dartmouth. So really anybody is welcome to be on these calls.
So I just put into the chat the Hunger Action Month, which really describes briefly what's been going on and some of the pieces that we're working on. There's a ton of different pieces that are all connected, from policy to the direct service side. Everything is connected in the food system. So we just encourage you to be part of that. All right, well, thank you all for being here. You can always reach out if you have other questions separately, or if you want to set up a meeting separately, we're happy to do that. Thank you for being here today.